Thrilled to be here. This is my second Beef Initiative Summit, and it is just an honor to be back and to be giving this presentation again. So thank you all for having me. And if you were at the last summit, this will be a repeat session for you, but I'm gonna try and go through like a shorter version of it, given the time restraints. So when Slim originally asked me to come up with a presentation for the Beef Initiative, that was like an absolute hell yeah for me right away. And then I kind of thought about it for a couple days afterwards, and I was like, well, what did I just sign up for? I don't know anything about ranching. I don't know anything about farming. What am I gonna do? Like go stand up in front of a bunch of ranchers and talk about like taproot activation and SHA 256 and hashing out, like I'm gonna sound like a complete lunatic. So it took me a while to kind of think of how I'm going to relate Bitcoin and ranching. And so I started thinking about, what kind of problems ranchers and farmers might face. And I started thinking about what kind of problems I've faced and how Bitcoin has helped me, and so it's, I approach Bitcoin from a self-custodial point of view, taking control over my own keys, having control over my own money. I approach Bitcoin from a censorship resistant point of view, making sure that I can make any transaction I want to make without being stopped. And for me, that has solved problems of like the state coming in and garnishing my paycheck, or not being able to get access to basic financial services, being rejected from bank after bank after bank because they didn't like something that was in my articles of incorporation. And so for me, Bitcoin has solved some money problems. And I think money problems is a universal issue, right? Everybody has money problems. But I needed a better nexus to ranching. And so I kept thinking, and I recalled that I actually had met a rancher at one point about 10 years ago, back in 2012. He's a Colorado rancher. His name is Vern Wagner. And I met him in a very precarious situation, and he told me his story, and it left an impact on me. And I started recalling this story that he told me. And it all started coming back to me about how the state had come in and taken everything from this man and ground him down to dust over 15 years. And it made me think about how a lot of people have this perception that when they get in a fight with the state or they're battling the state, that it's going to be some like Waco shootout or some Ruby Ridge situation. And, they don't really think about what it really looks like when you're in trouble and you're going up against the state and they're trying to take everything they can from you. When they're trying to get their tyrannical claws into anything they can possibly get that belongs to you. And so I'm going to tell you this story about Vern Wagner. But first, I'm going to talk a little bit about Bitcoin. And so the agenda I've got, I'm going to do a real brief introduction, and then I'm going to give you some context. I think a lot of people here are familiar with Bitcoin, but I just kind of want to talk about it from my point of view so we're all on the same page. And then I want to talk about the asymmetric advantages of Bitcoin. And then I'm going to get into that looming threat and then talk about Vern's story. And I'm going to try and blaze through this because I've got about 23 minutes. So who's Econoalchemist? Econoalchemist is my pseudonym. I've been in the Bitcoin space since late 2018. I currently work with 3 companies: Upstream Data, Bitcoin Magazine, and the Brains blog. And why do I support the Beef Initiative? Well, it's for my family's health and well-being. It's to gain that economic incentive. Prior to the Beef Initiative, we were paying double the price for grass-fed, grass-finished beef from the store. And when we started using the Beef Initiative, we were like including the shipping costs, the next day air shipping costs to get the frozen beef to us. It was half of what we were spending at the store. So there was an economic incentive there for us. And we could use Bitcoin to buy that beef. So it adds to that Bitcoin circular economy. It minimizes reliance on conglomerates, and it supports small businesses, and it helps us reclaim control over our food and aligns us with a supply chain that's more in tune with our values as a family. So what is Bitcoin? Very simply, Bitcoin is software. It's free and open source software. It's running on computers all around the world. It's a decentralized network of nodes that verify transactions. And currently, estimates have it that there's over 47,000 Bitcoin nodes in the world that are running this software verifying transactions. And so when I say free, I don't mean free like gratis. I mean free as in free to download, free to build on, free to use any way you want to use it. The Bitcoin network is not going to discriminate against you based on your jurisdiction, based on the color of your skin, based on your economic background. There is nothing that will stop your transaction from going through on the Bitcoin network. It doesn't matter if your financial institution is holding you up against some moral standard that they think you don't pass. There are no purity tests in Bitcoin. Bitcoin, I guess I kind of covered this slide. There's no permission, there's no intermediaries, unbreakable security. Bitcoin doesn't discriminate, even when the state calls you a criminal. And that's important, especially when we start looking at the landscape today and how fast the pendulum is swinging and the veracity at which that pendulum is swinging. You may wake up tomorrow and find that the activities you are doing today, which are perfectly fine and legal, are illegal tomorrow. You know, think back to when they told you not to go over to your family's house for Thanksgiving, and think about some of the consequences that you were facing. You just never know what they're going to come up with next. And so what is proof of work? I threw this slide in there because there's going to be a lot of narratives that are stirring up currently, and it's going to get worse about Bitcoin's energy use. And so I wanted to throw this slide in there just to kind of get ahead of the energy FUD. So there's the nodes, there's like 50,000 of those running all around the world verifying transactions, but then there's these ASIC computers, application-specific integrated circuits. These provide the hashing power that are including the blocks in the blockchain, okay? So these are different than the nodes. There's actually millions of these computers running all around the globe, and they need a lot of energy to do that. And so the resources consumed prove that the work has been done. And so it's very energy intensive. It's difficult to compute this work, but it's very easy to verify. And it's the one-way transformation of energy into computational power that gives this its strength, because that creates a physical connection to the real world. And so you may find in the near future that if you're talking to somebody about Bitcoin, they may tell you, oh, well, proof of stake is better because it doesn't use, you know, Ethereum just merged and they reduced their energy usage by 99.95%. Proof of stake is a closed loop system, okay? There's no connection to the real world. And so you cannot counterfeit energy. You have to put in those resources to make Bitcoin work. There's no other way to get to the result of a valid block unless you brute force it with all of this computational power. And the only way you can get that computational power is with a lot of energy. And so that means where, as in proof of stake, somebody can just put up the capital to have the validator node running, and you don't know where they got that capital. You don't know who they are. They're staking the very capital that network creates. It's a completely closed loop system. Whereas in Bitcoin, you have to have people with actual resources, with actual access to energy. You have to have a connection to the real world. And so there's a very big difference between proof of work and proof of stake. And I'm just trying to give you my perspective. Proof of stake isn't where it's at. Proof of work is where it's at. And so there's this asymmetric advantage. Math is greater than law. It doesn't matter what the laws of man say. It's not going to change how math works. And this is a graphic I made based off of the Gadsden flag. So it's 2 to the power of 256. That's the number space in Bitcoin. And so basically, your private key is somewhere in that number space. And it is so astronomically difficult for anyone to try and brute force that number and take your Bitcoin, that as long as you have your private key and you don't give up access of it to anybody, nobody can take your Bitcoin from you. It doesn't matter if they're putting the full weight of the violence of the state down upon you. All the military might in the world is not going to change how this math works. They can throw you in a cage, they can threaten you with your life, but so long as you don't give up that key, nobody's getting that Bitcoin. It's not going to move. And so that's interesting. When you start thinking about physical property in the world, you start thinking about cattle getting confiscated, you start thinking about houses getting confiscated, land. How do you shield yourself when the state's coming down on you? And so by having self-custody of your Bitcoin, you have something that nobody can touch. You could literally take all of the energy that the sun produces and use it to pump into computers to try and break that private key. It's not going to happen. This is like on the scale of, if I were to select a completely random atom out of the entire observable universe, would anyone in this room be able to tell me which atom I selected? Like that's how large this number space is. And so this asymmetric advantage is empowered when you don't attach your identity to your Bitcoin. When you do attach your identity to your Bitcoin, you start reducing that power of this asymmetric advantage. And so KYC is dangerous. It's an invasive scare tactic. It irrevocably connects your identity to your Bitcoin transactions. It enables walled gardens, permissioned financial services, confiscation, tax. In the hands of the state, your freedoms are at risk. In the hands of hackers, your life are at risk. And then there's these looming threats. I mean, look at what happened with the Canadian Freedom Convoy. They weaponized money. They've been weaponizing money for decades. The Dutch farmers, personal property theft, movement restrictions, compliance through punishment. Like, if you can't see what trajectory we're on, they want to control you. They want to restrict your movement. They want you scared. They want you weak. They don't want you to have land. The land empowers you to provide for yourself in a way that you don't need the state to provide for you. It gives you independence. They don't want you eating healthy food. That makes you strong. It makes you clear-minded. They don't want you thinking clearly. They don't want you strong. They want you weak. They want you controllable. They don't want you to make any financial transaction you want. They want you to ask their permission to make financial transactions. The ESG, like Will was talking about, the attack on decarbonizing the world, it's absolutely insane. They're going to strangle independence through a carbon credit economy. They're going after farmland. They've been manipulating big agri markets to be reliant on artificial products, and then they point to the effects of those products as justification for the confiscation of that land. It's been a 50-year land grab. You got Bill Gates out there buying up all the farmland, and they're trying to take away what people use to sustain themselves. It's a manufactured climate crisis to control the individual. And if you don't believe me, I mean, we've got people out there, executives from Alibaba, talking about individual carbon footprint trackers. You know, they're telling you carbon is bad, and they're pointing to that as like you need to pay a tax for breathing. Okay, so now we're going to get into the real world examples. So if anyone here has like seen my content, you've probably seen me like shooting some steel Bitcoin backup plates with like different caliber guns and like blowing up 3D printed objects with tannerite. Well, I was shooting these videos on my buddy's land. He's got an 80-acre parcel down in Hartselle, Colorado. And so about 10 years ago, we got in his truck and we went down there, and he had just finished doing some work on his truck, and we wanted to test out the truck and take a drive down there. So this is in January of 2012. And the idea was that, well, we'll just cruise down to the land and, you know, we'll shoot some guns, we'll test out the truck, we'll be back home by dinner time, like no big deal. Well, we got stuck in the snow. ran the truck into a ditch. We're in the middle of nowhere. And so the plan was, well, we'll hoof it into the property and then stay the night there. And sorry, the slide's kind of cut off, but that's an aerial view of the property. And then I keep zooming out just to show like how completely remote and desolate this area is. Basically, we're right here. And this is like, look at that. So this huge area, this is about 130,000 acres that is stewarded by a guy named Vern Wagner. And so we're stuck in the ditch. We hike into his property, and we almost froze to death because we weren't planning on staying the night there, so we didn't have sleeping bags or anything. Long story short, Vern saved our asses the next morning and pulled us out of that ditch, brought us over to his house, and his wife, Vayon, started making breakfast for us. And while we were warming up and getting breakfast, Vern started telling me his story. And so I'm going to try and get through this story in about 10 or 15 minutes. And just fair warning, this is a tedious story. There's a lot of information here. It takes a long time to get through it, and it may be a little uncomfortable and a little bit painful, but that is by design because I'm trying to illustrate what it looks like when the state tries to grind a man down to dust. This has been a war of attrition, and my presentation tries to capture that. Vern was born in 1933 to a cattle ranching family near Lamar. He left home at age 14, served in the armed forces, graduated with a degree in agriculture from CSU. By 2000, he started a grazing association with small parcel owners. The operation quickly expanded to over 8,000 private and BLM leases, and his ranch, Cross/Ranch, controlled about 130,000 acres at about 9,000 feet elevation. For the high altitude ranching, Vern raised black baldy cattle. This is like roughly what his parcel looked like. This is 130,000 acres near Hartselle, Colorado. And so everything that happened to Vern is chronicled in the local newspaper out of Hartselle, and it's called The Flume. Well, when I tried recalling Vern's story, I didn't remember all the details because it was 10 years ago that he told me this story. So I kept going back, and everything was pointing at the Flume, and I was trying to fill in all the gaps with the articles. And the Flume has this paywall, so I couldn't access those articles. Luckily, some hero out there used Bitcoin to buy a anonymous digital debit card and get through the paywall. And then they took all of those articles and put them on the Internet Archive. And I happened to stumble upon these 126 Internet Archives of all the Flume articles related to Vern. So I just happened to put those on my website, which you can access from that QR code. Now, Vern entered into a lease agreement. This is where everything started. He entered into a lease agreement with this company called Hartselle Spring Ranch for 50,000 acres. Well, HSR only owned 8,000 of those acres. The other 42,000 acres were owned by another company called Club Acquisition that they were partnered with. Club Acquisition wanted Vern off of that land because they wanted to make a housing development and they wanted to graze bison there. Well, a civil lawsuit ensued after that, and that's kind of where this conflict all started, okay? So Vern is trying to graze his cattle there, and they want him off the land. Well, by July 2003, a Park County attorney named Stephen Groom, who was friends with the HSR company, he created this new ordinance, and this ordinance made it unlawful grazing a criminal misdemeanor, and bison were explicitly excluded. So basically what happened here was they made it so that if your bison are caught on someone else, or if your cattle are caught on someone else's property, then you can get a criminal misdemeanor for that in Park County. The problem is Colorado is what's known as a fence-out state. And that means that if you don't want cattle on your property, you, as the property owner, have to fence them out. So this ordinance was in direct conflict with state law. In November of 2003, criminal charges were filed against Vern Wagner, and Vern Wagner reacted by suing Park County to challenge the ordinance since it was against state law. By 2004, Groom, the attorney who came up with that ordinance, was appointed to deputy DA of Park County. And in February 2004, a Park County judge ruled the ordinance invalid. The criminal charges against Vern were dismissed. Groom motions an appeal for that ruling. And in November 2004, the appeal stood and the decision was reversed, and those criminal charges against Wagner were reinstated. And so in January 2005, Wagner escalates the matter to the Colorado Supreme Court, and they denied the case. They said they weren't going to deal with it. So basically what happened here is that Vern said to the courts, hey, this ordinance is against state law. And the courts were like, yeah, we're not going to touch this. This is between you and the county. In 2006, Wagner was ordered to evict the lease. And so he did. He kept his cattle off of that property. And for the next few years, the conflict seemed resolved. Then Groom, the attorney from Park County, was promoted to a district judge. And so this guy is starting to accumulate more power and influence in his county. And so in 2009, Wagner gets arrested at like 71 years old for being in contempt of court because his cattle were found on the HSR property. In 2009, those charges were dismissed as Wagner was not provided adequate time to respond to the situation prior to the arrest. The same day those contempt charges were dropped, HSR filed a new affidavit against Wagner, and then Wagner was arrested again, and this time held in jail for 5 days. So this is two separate instances. But the second time, they violated 10 of his constitutional rights, a Colorado court would later find. And they basically went out and arrested him. They didn't read him his rights. They didn't tell him what he was being charged with. This is a completely separate incident from the one that happened a day prior, but they held him in jail for 5 days this time. So this is just going to show how the judge is now weaponizing the sheriffs in Park County against Vern Wagner to try and shut this man down because he has this grudge with him over that original lease dispute. No brand inspectors were called out to confirm that it was Vern's cattle on that land. And so he was held against his will without being read his rights, having his constitutional rights violated. Nobody could tell him what the charges were for. Groom was bloodthirsty and in a position to use the full force of the Park County Sheriff's animal control officers and the Department of Agriculture against Wagner. Wagner said that he found out after the fact that the ranch hands he was hiring to help him out were actually undercover PETA activists that were providing these county sheriffs and these county officials false and exaggerated information. In the winter of 2009 and 2010, it was the second harshest winter on record for Park County. And in March 2010, one count of, sorry, I'm just going to zoom this out so I can see it all. In March 2010, one count of criminal misdemeanor animal cruelty for a cow that was found dead on one of Wagner's pastures. And so Wagner was under investigation for animal cruelty for that. And the animal control officers claim that they found 144 dead cattle. So you got to understand, this is like immediately after a terrible winter. Vern's got like 2,000 cattle in his herd, okay? So 144 cattle, that's not a very outrageous percentage of your herd to lose, especially after a weather event like that. And this isn't out of the, it may sound like a lot of cattle if, you're not familiar with ranching, but I think anyone who is familiar with ranching will recognize that like 144 dead cows out of 2,000 isn't unheard of. Wagner denied that the cattle were his. He said maximum 100 of those cows were his. Animal control refused to disclose the locations of the animals so that Wagner could verify if those were his cattle. And in May of 2010, a temporary restraining order blocks Wagner from moving the livestock. And the county veterinarian started exaggerating the conditions of the cattle in direct contrast to witnesses, neighbors, reporters, and independent veterinarian that Vern had come in to kind of, bring some validity to opposing opinions. The Colorado Commissioner of Agriculture, John Stolp, he filed a complaint and ordered relief in the form of money for the state to cover the investigative costs that they had incurred going after Wagner for all of this time. So basically what happened was the animal control officers found like one dead calf after that winter. They started like looking through the rest of the ranch property. They find like 144 dead cows, and then they throw their arms up and they tell Vern, like, they put this restraining order on him. You can't move your cattle. You can't do anything with your cattle. You're under investigation. They're racking up all these expenses investigating this guy because the judge is like trying to get all these people to like move in on Vern and like racking up all this money and investigating him. And so the Colorado commissioner's like, what is going on with this investigation? We need to recoup some of these costs. So what did they do? They sent the sheriffs out to Vern's property because he had this restraining order and he couldn't interfere with any officials or even touch his own cattle. And the sheriffs started rounding up his cattle and putting them in a trailer. They grabbed 379 of his cattle, and they did it under the premise that they were trying to save animals that were endangered, but they grabbed the healthiest cattle out of his herd. They took the life out of his herd, loaded them onto a trailer, and brought them down to an auction house and sold them. And then they took that money and used it to recoup their investigative costs that they had racked up against Vern. Wagner files for Chapter 11 bankruptcy by January 2011. After 15 months of investigation, so the culmination of this investigation, he was charged with 4 counts of animal cruelty. 4 counts. They stole 379 cows. Thousand Peaks Ranch sues Vern for overdue leases. Judge Groom decides that Wagner is prohibited from owning and managing cattle in Park County. So basically the judge came in and said, you can't own cattle. You can't manage cattle. And so all of Wagner's remaining cattle and things related to remaining cattle were ordered to be seized by the judge. And so the state just started coming in and taking everything. And Vern is being told, like, you can't interfere. You can't touch anything. You can't touch your own cattle. In January of 2012, Wagner seeks a change of venue for the upcoming trial for the 4 counts of animal cruelty due to the rampant corruption in Park County. And then so Judge Groom drops the original 4 charges and then adds 21 new criminal charges to the original offense, and then denies the change of venue. And then Wagner was ordered to pay former partners in his business $925,000 in a civil case. And who was the presiding judge over that case? It was Groom. And so what had happened was that the county officials started going to Wagner's partners and former partners and telling them, hey, if you help us out and testify against this guy, then we'll give you some of the stuff that we're taking from him. That's what was happening. $925,000 to his former partners. Immediately after that trial, Vern's wife suffers a heart attack. She survived, but this goes to show you how much stress was building up on this family. The criminal trial for the cruelty charges began. The jury found Wagner guilty of one count of animal cruelty for cow number 132. 1 count. They took $1 million from him. They stole all his cattle. They prohibited him from ranching in the county. And then there was another civil lawsuit, and Judge Groom ordered a $1.3 million foreclosure on Vern's property. His partners are coming against him by the influence of the county officials. Everybody's trying to take what Vern has and grind this man down to dust. And so the state will steal anything and everything from you that they can get their hands on. KYC enables control. Controlled money is weaponized money. Weaponized money restricts your movement, your freedoms. It forces you off of your land. Shield yourself with unconfiscatable, permissionless peer-to-peer money. Opt out of their poisoned food supply with an intelligent food supply. You're not going to protect everything you have from the state's reach, but at least you will still have access to basic financial tools that will allow you to interact peer-to-peer without permission. Mining Bitcoin is a great way to accumulate non-KYC Bitcoin through your utility bill. And so Vern is still living in Hartselle. He's still at his house. He doesn't have any cattle. He has a few horses. The state came in and took everything from him. It was a 15-year process from start to finish. They came in and took everything this man had. They ran his sons off. He is a third-generation cattle rancher. His sons want nothing to do with cattle ranching. They left home. They went on to start other businesses. It completely devastated what the legacy was that this family was building. They came in and took everything from him, and they didn't do it in a Waco-style shootout situation. They did it very slowly. They did it by changing the laws that made something you were doing today, which was totally legal, making it illegal, and then going after you, using that law, that brand new law, using that as justification to start going after you. And then once they got a little string to pull on, they just kept going and kept going and kept going and kept grinding this man down to nothing. And so this is what it looks like when the state goes after you. Is Bitcoin going to solve that? People say Bitcoin fixes everything. Well, it's not going to fix all of that, but it is going to give you a little bit of a cushion and give you some ability to interact peer-to-peer with people around you and keep putting food on your table and try to keep a roof over your head when no one else wants you to transact, when they're freezing all of your assets, when they're shutting down your bank accounts, when the state is labeling you as a criminal, and when the bank is holding you up against some moral standard purity test and saying that you don't pass. Bitcoin is going to allow you to do the things you still need to do. And that's all I've got for my presentation. So thank you.